As a teen, I developed a passion for filmmaking of sorts, thanks to films mainly, online skits, and short stories I was consuming. Not so much the directing aspect, but cinematography itself. I was always fascinated by the idea of telling a story with just a camera and the decisions you make on how to frame scenes. And the first film that really stimulated my psyche was The Revenant. The Revenant tells the story of Hugh Glass, a frontiersman who partakes in a revenge path after the death of his son, while also dealing with heavy injuries dealt in a bear encounter. Looking from the outside, its premise sounds pretty simple, besides the bear attack, which is an interesting element, but for me, what makes the film whole and awestruck is the cinematography and how every single choice of how to frame shots elevates the experience. Things such as how the camera intimately stays close to you during his best and worst moments, the lingering panning of some shots, how the use of natural lighting helps enhance the nature and wilderness of the environments, how raw and brutal the violence is captured up close, to even small aspects such as breathing obfuscating the camera, makes the viewer feel like an active participant in this dangerous world. It's specific decisions like this that defines this film's mood and feel. And speaking of mood and feels, it's no surprise video games have attempted to emulate said techniques to various degrees of success. By now, it should be pretty apparent how AAA games have chased for a photorealistic cinematic look for quite some time, and some outputs have fared better than others. Sony exclusives are a perfect example of this template, as well as most other major AAA devs. But what that often leads to sometimes is an homogeneous art style that doesn't see much change besides technical advancement, and it's understandable why. Budgets are ballooning, and this template is the perfect structure to attract the highest common denominator to see profit. It's a safe choice for sure, but in the end it can jade some people and make it feel like only visuals take the highest priority, with gameplay and story second. And sometimes that statement rings true for some games than others. With that in mind, I would like to present you the following game.
Lynch! I'll fucking kill you!
This is Kane and Lynch 2, Dog Days, developed by IO Interactive of Hitman fame, and to be honest, this one is a tough nut to crack. A game's presentation is not just the visual representation itself, but also the usage of other elements such as audio, in the case of cutscenes, their composition and staging, the narrative, and gameplay to some extent. And for each component, some shine more than others, and in this game's case, it sits in this unique position where it's attempting at something experimental without adhering to most established structures this industry has set for the past 40 or so years, which makes it an interesting subject to dissect and analyze its goals and intentions. Before I start the video, I want to leave a spoiler warning for the entire game, so if you ever plan on playing it someday, I suggest you beat the game first and come here afterwards to watch this. Other than that, let's examine what makes this game's presentation unique to this day.
Glazer, it's Lynch. Yeah, he's here. You'll take us to the docks now? Alright, great. Yeah, Kane wants to run over some things with you too. Alright, you pick us up in 20? Okay, I'll see you soon. Bye.
So, I feel I should start to what is the most eye-catching and pervasive element of its presentation, the visual identity. We usually view art styles in games as different ways and manners of portraying elements to transmit information. Sometimes that is through realism, or sometimes it is stylized, but as long as it fits the project needs, it's pretty much set in stone for the duration of its development. In the case of games that aim for photorealism, they usually have a hard time of distinguishing themselves from other titles, so the best way they do it is through visual tones and directions. Games like Call of Duty Modern Warfare, God of War, and Cyberpunk 2077 all feature photorealistic visuals. The thing that separates them is that Call of Duty is a military shooter, where most of the visual language is military-grade equipment and weaponry. God of War is a fantasy game, where we see magic, fantastical beasts, and a stoic dad who can't stop shouting boy. And with Cyberpunk 2077, we have a futuristic interpretation of the future, meaning high focus on sci-fi elements, the prevalence of body augmentations, and environments that are larger than life. That is defined as visual identity. As if it wasn't obvious, Kane and Lynch 2 is a game that aims for photorealism, but its visual identity is its camcorder style approach of the player camera, not just in gameplay but in cutscenes as well. In the dev diaries, the developers go into detail about their inspiration for user-generated content and documentaries, more specifically, unprofessional and messy recorded videos you would find on YouTube or any other video streaming service. And the translation here works brilliantly. I honestly see this game as the equivalent of a live leak video or something disturbing you find in the dark web. Not to say I've been on both because I'm way too scared of doing so. In terms of layers, we have 3 that make this whole, with the first being the general camera behavior. When you stand still or walk normally, the camera remains relatively stable, with a bit of wobble, but as soon as you start running, the camera is all over the place, with extreme shaking as if we, the players with the camera on our hands, were struggling to keep up with the action occurring. Also, when you die, the camera immediately falls to the ground, which further implies the presence of someone else holding the camera. I'd personally say this style has close resemblance to found footage movies, where the heightened intensity of the action is a hallmark of the genre. Good examples of this are the first Cloverfield and Blair Witch films, which emphasize it heavily on this approach. The second layer is attention to detail. On top of the general camera behavior, you have smaller aspects that increase immersion. For example, we have a super grainy filter that not only exaggerates and downscales the output of the colors in the scenery, but it also sells the idea of this being an older camera, which coincides with the whole environmental iconography established in Hong Kong cinema. Alongside the grain, the game features macro blocking, usually present in heavy shootouts when you take damage. During explosions, the camera blurs slightly, desaturates and becomes grainier the closer you are to it, and the most interesting of all, whenever nudity or major violence is present, such as shooting someone's head off with a shotgun for example, the game automatically pixelates it, censoring the mess you just made. The third, and the one that's actually the hardest to catch on, is the audio. In super specific occasions, I've managed to catch on that using guns with a high rate of fire and during explosions in proximity, the audio tends to screech, but so far that's the only thing I've managed to catch.
Chopper! Watch out! We gotta take it out! It's kill or be killed!
In the end, these 3 elements amount to what we see in-game from beginning to end. It's a grungy and unhinged representation of a descent into hell. And it's such a shame that 12 years later, there haven't been any AAA games that I'm aware of that have attempted to replicate the style, which is understandable, but the point still stands. For me, the icing on the cake for the entire game is 2 specific occasions where everything I just described comes together. The first one is during a shootout in the streets, where you're taking cover inside a DVD store. Across the street you have a ton of policemen blocking your way. If you happen to shoot one of the gas canisters, this happens. From the violent camera shake, the screechy audio, and the color manipulation, it is such a cool moment to witness. The second one is a really out of nowhere fourth wall breaking moment during an escape on the train, where we get caught by the military and one of the soldiers directly looks at us, and even touches the camera, acknowledging our presence in the end, which surprised me.
Honey, it's me. Yeah, I'm running a little late. I'll be careful. Look, I'll call you. I know, but we ran into some trouble. Yeah. We'll just meet at the restaurant. Yeah. Yeah. I'll be there. I promise. Okay, I'll call you later. Bye.
Another strong element that contributes strongly to the presentation is the music. When I usually talk about music and videos, I first take the courtesy of listening to the full OST first before giving my thoughts, because I like to highlight it as much as possible if I enjoyed it. Having said that, the soundtrack is so unique and bizarre I shouldn't even be surprised at this point. In the official soundtrack, the album is split into two halves. First you have what is essentially a C-pop album, full of guest features and everything. These tend to play in the main menu and around various locations in game, as if it was a natural element of the world, which I always appreciate when devs go the extra mile to make something believable. What makes it even more interesting is that it's such an unorthodox addition, but one that makes sense because not only do they showcase the beauty of Shanghai really well, but it also heavily contrasts with the second half of this soundtrack, which is the music that plays in-game during missions. Composer Mon Amour, a popular punk vocalist and composer, lends her talent to what it can be described as a dark, industrial ambient music that complements the atmosphere of the experience, both in tone and subject. In-game, you may have a hard time noticing the soundtrack because most of the gunfire and dialogue obfuscates it, but in the in-between moments, you can definitely feel the energy the soundtrack brings to the scenarios, a very heavy and oppressive one. Sometimes the tracks will blend with the C-pop tracks, other times it will feature random samples of everyday object sounds like steel drums and barrels rolling over, or even distant dog barks in a neighborhood, which in a way exacerbate the feeling of loneliness and despair the longer it keeps going. It is genuinely great, and I wish the sound mix helped it stand out more during gameplay.
Sue. It's me. Call me back. I fucked up bad. We gotta get out of the city. Disappear. Just meet us down the Shuangxi as soon as you can. I love you. Bye.
After praising the game so far, I really need to bring its shortcomings forth, because as hardhouse and experimental as it is, the gameplay and the overall game design really holds it back, as it could have been IO's greatest game in terms of design since Hitman. Also, for context, I've never played the first Kane and Lynch game, so I won't be able to make comparisons of how designed that game is. Having said that, the game does a poor job of being a video game with variety. Mechanically, the game is very simple, and in its entirety it amounts to a corridor shooter, where you go from room to room just shooting stuff, and that's not to say that's a bad design choice. A good example of a game that does this really well is Doom 2016. The ultimate issue here is the lack of mechanical depth. In Doom, as you have to be on the move as ammo only drops when defeating enemies, you also have different enemy types that require different strategies of being defeated, as well as most weapons featuring different fire modes, and when you combine everything, it becomes a chess game where every move matters. Here in Kane and Lynch, you'll spend the majority of the time just shooting your way through levels without any sort of variety to keep it fresh. The level design suffers from this depth problem as well, as you'll be going from rooms and corridors without any sort of variety in its structure. Max Payne 3, which actually came out 2 years later, is on the same vein as Kane and Lynch and many other linear games design philosophies, but once again, Max Payne here is the exception thanks to its variety. For example, in the game's third mission, Just Another Day at the Office, where Max and Raoul get ambushed at the stadium, the player goes from a shootout in the stadium seats where there's a ton of verticality, covering Raoul with a sniper rifle, avoiding another sniper shooter from getting to you, while also dealing with other enemies coming at you from all sides. And that right there is the type of variety this game solely misses, and in return, it results in a very basic gameplay experience.
Get the fuck off of me!
Don't let them hurt me!
一蠢的贱人！
Please, Lynch, make them stop!
闭嘴啊！你这个喜欢人心爱的贱妇！
No! Leave her alone!
I said leave her alone!
Tell him to stop! Please!
It's got nothing to do with her! Fuck you! I'll fucking...
There's also the narrative that fails to achieve what the devs were trying to aim for. In many interviews, the devs clearly stated they wanted the narrative to be an exploration of themes such as isolation and loneliness in this aggregating shell of violence. But what it felt for the devs an interesting approach, in this subject matter, most of the depicted violence feels like window dressing for aesthetic purposes, instead of delving deep into the psychological and damaging effects it can have in the overall moment, from our main protagonist's actions to the literal depiction during gameplay and cutscenes. And by the way, I have no issues with extreme violence, as I enjoy some myself, and games should express themselves how they want. But when you tackle a subject, you should make sure you also delve into the whats and whys of it, so you can portray it as accurately as possible. A similar game of the same structure that does this really well is Spec Up the Line, where you have multiple story beats and gameplay elements that are heavily relied upon to get the point across. There's also the fact the game takes place in Asia. Before making assumptions, I'd like to bring forth that intentions matter in every decision you do during game development, and I'm pretty certain the team made Shanghai a place of choice for a specific reason. Was it because of just how the place looks, and placing two white men killing a bunch of non-white people made their point of violence more poignant? Well, that could have worked, as the game in that nature would be calling out imperialistic and colonialist practices, but as we've acknowledged, it doesn't even treat its subject matters with nuance, so we can discard that. Going back to violence, could it maybe be an exploration in the psychological torment these two cause everyone around them, given their deplorable human beings? We do have perfect examples of this, when Kane shoots the daughter of a drug lord, which sets the majority of the narrative in motion, or when during the escape from the torture room we find Sue, Lynch's girlfriend, body mutilated and ditched in a corner. Once again, that may be the point, but throughout the playthrough, both characters do acknowledge that when together, they just cause a big mess.
You okay?
No.
Sorry, this went to shit.
It's all mine.
Guess I screwed up.
Let's just get the hell out of Shanghai. Fucking China.
But never once they take the time to look for ways to de-escalate their situation, which makes the entire narrative really sour and childish once you start to deeply think about it. Once again, Spec Ops The Line hit the nail on the head when tackling the destructive nature of a man's action and both physical and psychological consequences. In the end, this is up to you to decide and dictate what you feel the game approaches well and where it falls short, but for me, it's those two elements.
Jenny. It's your father. Listen, I'm sorry. I know we haven't spoken since, you know. Look, I'm coming home. I hope we can put the past behind us. I'm done with all this, baby. And I hope you can forgive me. But sweetheart, if you don't see me, I want you to know I love you.
Honestly, this is one of those games I'm kinda disappointed in because you have this really beautiful and interesting aesthetic choice that works really well on what it wants to achieve, but at the same time, the general game design and story really owes it back on what it could have been a twisting and brutal exploration of these themes. But for the time I spent both praising and ripping the game for a bit, I still recommend giving the game a shot, as I feel there aren't many games, especially AAA, that approach its presentation the way this game does. Given it came out in 2010, the two best ways to play the game are on PC and Xbox. On PC you'll have to tinker a bit to get it to launch, and I believe there's no controller support, as I wanted to use that version for this analysis, which makes the Xbox version, the one I played, the most convenient way to play it. It's backwards compatible with the current consoles, and it runs at 60 frames per second, albeit in its original resolution, but it benefits to the game's presentation when you think about it. And if you want to go full hardcore, play the original PS3 and 360 releases, so there's that. Kane and Lynch 2 Dog Days takes such a novelty approach to its presentation that everyone interested on how to present their point across in interesting ways, or even fans of game design to game designers themselves, if you can get past all the repetitive and awkward gameplay moments, I'd say you're in for a good time.